My name's Claire Flynn, and some of you may know me from my visits to Lake Tyers, and some of you may be my parents. Hi, Mum and Dad. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm zooming in from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri. I'd also like to pay my respects to the elders past and present. I would also like to pay respects to the people of the Kurnai where the festival is happening. I hope that you've enjoyed listening to and sharing stories, and that you're excited for our chat today with Fiona, Crawford and Lee McGowan. Together, they've written a great social history called Never Say Die, the 100-year overnight success of Australian women's football. Fiona Crawford is a writer, editor and researcher whose work spans social and environmental issues, the arts and football, all the good stuff. And Lee McGowan is a researcher, writer and teacher. His primary interest is critical football studies. I think there may be many of us who consider ourselves uncritical football studies. Thank you, Lee and Fiona, for joining the people of Lake Tyers to talk about your important account of women's football in Australia and surfacing the figures, the milestones, the stories and issues in the development of the game. I'd also like to thank Helen and the team at Lake Tyers for creating space to talk about women's sport. And today we're talking about the round ball game. I found your book a fascinating account of the game, and even as a self-identified fan of women's sport, I've learned so much in reading your work, so thank you. You write in your introduction that facts and figures are important and not always complete or easy to find, remember. And your focus is on the stories of the players, administrators, officials and fans that weave a much richer tapestry of the game. You note that historians Elaine Watson, Roy Hay and Bill Murray have identified that we are never allowed to see the full picture of activities. So I'd like to ask you, and you can introduce yourselves a little more if you'd like to, what was the experience like documenting the histories of women playing football and being denied the opportunity to play football before we reach this new dawn of semi-professional sporting life? How hard was it to surface these stories?
Lee, did you want to start?
Well, I was going to offer to you, but I think one of the things I think that's really important to say is that women playing sport from right back in the late 1800s when they started playing was a politicised act. You know, it was all about women footballers were co-opted into marches and the suffragettes, and you know, decisions about what women could wear and what women would choose to wear, rather. Sorry. So it's always had that sense, and it felt a bit like this writing that book too, especially for me. You know, a wee fat white heterosexual dad. You know, like so it was a whole new opening for me. But this idea that history is a weapon, I think, was one of the things that I always had in the back of my mind, and something that you've talked about, Claire. If you can see it, you can be it, you know, and so us unearthing these stories was really important. Outside of actually trawling through the dusty archives and the fantastic resource that Trove is, and having to look like forensically for references to the women's game, once you actually get to a point in the game, the early 60s in Australia, where there are still women around who played in that time, once you get them talking about football, the stories would flow with absolute no barrier whatsoever. I mean, like, I had to build some trust, obviously, that Fiona wouldn't have had Fiona would have found easier, but because I was always because of the treatment that men have put on women all through sport, there was obviously a good reason for that mistrust in me coming into that space, you know. So those are the only difficulties that we had, finding the stuff and overcoming those barriers. But once you build that trust, people were really happy to tell their stories and share them, and it was it was like this really kind of at times cathartic, joyful reminiscence and sharing of experiences, and lots of women really surprised that we were interested in telling their stories too, which I found marvellous and a wee bit shocking at times. Sorry, I talked a lot there.
Yep.
I definitely went in with sort of saying, look, unless you were there and witnessed it firsthand, it probably wasn't documented. So a lot of my interviews, I said straight up, I'm really sorry, I probably don't know things that I should know. And I'm going to ask you to, to humor me and fill in the gaps for me. And I'm sorry if I'm going to ask you some silly questions. And people were really accommodating of that. So that was really, really pleasant.
Wonderful. And I guess, Fiona, you have the living history to kind of trove that you knew some of the people and you'd worked in the field. I guess my question, I wanted to ask you about how you framed the book the way you did, because you cover a lot of ground and touch on some really key ruptures in the history of the sport, not least that the constant and repetitive grind for legitimacy that women playing sport have to grind out. How did you decide what made it to the page? And if you could talk a little about who you wrote for, I'd like to hear from each of you.
I think there was definitely a point about halfway when we were trying to write it that we went, gee, covering the first 100 years was quite ambitious, and have we bitten off more than we can chew? It was definitely really hard to figure out what could go in, but by the same token, there were some themes that consistently emerged. So it was the barriers that they had to overcome, whether that was, the underfunding or the oversight or the lack of opportunity and resources. So in some ways it actually wrote itself, or it was really clear what needed to go in there. Obviously we would have loved to do more if we'd had more time and more pages, and because there's so much that we just didn't get a chance to cover. But yeah, in some ways it wrote itself, and it was quite an organic process, I guess you could say.
It's quite, I mean, on the one hand, I would say that I love it. It's quite an infuriating read as well, when they're just the same issues. Like, I did want to toss it a couple of times, and, it's historically the audacity to, ban women from grounds, to, which effectively keeps them out of the game for 50 years, those kinds of things. To see it just played out generation for generation is pretty...
It was really hard to write it as well, because it's hard to write about that stuff without just sounding like you're whinging or that you're complaining. So, our first couple of drafts, we had to really reshape it and try to find the voice, and where you're telling it and you're telling that it's unfair, and you're just trying to put it on the page, but you're also not trying to over explain it. Or would you, you'd say that we had that a couple of times, Lee, wouldn't you say?
Look, I think I'm trying to decide what goes in and what stays out. Like, the calendar was a big, like we talked about that a lot, whether we should include that or not. That kind of relentlessness, we're writing about the 1920s, and the exact same things are happening then as are happening in the 1960s and 70s, and then again in the 1990s, and they're not changing that much. I mean, if you look at the coverage of the W League now, after being given this huge chunk of money, the Fox still can't get their act together, and so it's like, this kind of persistence of the issues is infuriating. But at the same time as well, I think that through that, bringing all of these stories, other people's stories together into that space, it kind of, like diamonds are formed. You get these really kind of important takeaways from the book about the key issues that are affecting women's sport, I think, as well.
Yeah, I feel like there's probably 100 histories of the first 100 years, or thousands, really. And one account, which, not that I would want to focus on it, but in reading it, I was thinking, why do men really go out of their way to stop women participating in sport and having fun? Like, it's like there's some key stories about individual men who denied women coaching courses or inclusion at that level. What is that about?
Are you asking me as a man, Claire?
I'm asking society, like, what is that about? Like, really? Like, have we not played that out enough? And yes, as a man, like, what?
So I like the obviously it stems to that, like the emergence of football in Britain in the late 1800s was tied to the vote and women's rights, and Marie Sepier's book, Marriage, is it Love and Marriage, or Marriage Love, or Married Love, it was in 1918, where women are afforded agency outside the marriage and they stop being property, and stuff. So it stems back from that, and I think it's that what we're seeing now through movements like Black Lives Matter, where this group of elite people that are used to having the pie all the time, all of the pie all of the time, are finding that they may have to give over a few crumbs off the plate, and are reluctant to do that, and resentful of the fact that they have to give in away as well. So the problems haven't changed, or the nature of the problems haven't changed. I think men are just dicks, to be honest. For the most part.
I'll agree with you there.
Yeah. I spend most of my time trying my best not to be one. But I think one of the things, though, and it was something that we talked about before we started recording, is that I think one of the main reasons that women's football seems to be different to men's football is because it's in the face of adversity. It's a much more supportive community. It's a much more embracing community as well, really much more inclusive. There's a willingness to hear out other people's stories and take those on board. And it was as simple as if you were interested in playing football, then you could play, and I think that's really different from the kind of hard-edged, masculine, hyper-competitive environment that exists in male sports. Not that women's sports not competitive, sorry.
Yeah, no, I guess I struggle with that because, there's been 100 years of that thought dominating the social kind of reality. And it's just like, there's enough experience and there's enough evidence to show that if you back women and you back women's sports, you're backing a whole lot more. And that actually, with the rise of all the different codes, it generates success for cricket paying equal pay, AFLW coming along and paying people. That is shared. So the model's there. It's just like there's so much resistance.
The ban, one of the triggers for the ban in the 1920s was actually the fear that promoting women's sport would remove from men's sport, and that's what we're starting to see. So it should. Well, that's the thing. It's like Lewis FC in the UK are proving that it doesn't matter. If you've got a women's team there, as many people will go and watch that women's team as men's team, and you bring a whole new audience instead.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's not rational. It's the fear of that there's only so much of the pie to go around, instead of actually the reality is that the pie grows. Sort of to mix my metaphor a little bit, but yeah, so I think it's not rational, because what we find is that the moment, women are allowed to play sport, nothing bad happens to men's sport.
Well, I'm still prepared to shorten a few seasons, but anyway, I'd just like to talk for a little bit about the contribution of First Nation players and coaches to the game. In the book, you state, while some people were being kept out, the Australian media's tendency to present football as a non-Anglo ethnic game meant Indigenous players were more likely to be included. First Nation players and coaches were still subjected to overt racism at worst and unconscious bias, even in the best of circumstances, but were generally welcomed to and embraced by a game being marginalised by the mainstream. I'd like to hear from both of you about some of the greats that preceded the names that people might know now: Sam Kerr, Lydia Williams, and Kaya Simon.
I'd just say, well, I guess I would, not to put it down on it, but I think we don't know enough about some of those players, and I think there's a lot of players who potentially have missed out. One of the uncomfortable truths I feel, or that's not often discussed, is because women's sport has been so poorly paid or remunerated, it's felt in a lot of ways it's only been open to people who are middle class and able to be supported by their families, or to be able to afford to play. So I do wonder if there are many more players we don't know about. We've got a couple. Obviously, there's John Moriarty, who's obviously not a female player, but he's set up a foundation that has enabled many other First Nations people to come through and play, because he's providing scholarships. So I think we're going to see some more in the future, but I do think it's actually an area we could do better in. That said, we do talk about a couple of players in the book, which is something that Lee wrote about. So there definitely were players, but I think we can be doing a better job of it.
Yeah, I agree with what Fiona's saying, that there is an uncomfortable truth in that. So there's John Maynard's fantastic book. He highlights Karen Menzies as a player who started playing in 1976, fantastic player. By the Olympics, she was in the training. She was training with the team, the Matildas team, for the Olympics, and was just hassled so overtly with regard to her sexuality that she just decided to give it away altogether. So the game lost one of its best players because of a male coach's prejudices. In Queensland, a player, Leonie Young, she started playing when she was 13, 14, around the same time as Karen was playing in Sydney. She was the first Indigenous player to play for Queensland in 1980. But what we found out since the book was published, talking to Leonie, sadly her mum's passed now, but her mum played herself in the 1960s. So she would probably be the country's first Indigenous female player to play competitive football in Australia, you know. And Iris went on to form this amazing team called TV Warren in the mid to late 80s in Queensland, a team that was entirely made up of First Nations players. They had their own bus, they brought their own fans to the games and everything, and it really became this kind of a massive community around the football team, which is, as we all know, is what football's really about, you know. So those are just some of the examples, but there is some further work there to be done. On top of John's books, which has just been republished. It's a fantastic piece of work.
I'm really excited though as well. Like, for example, Lydia Williams has also written some books, and we're starting to see more of her own story and her own culture coming through. And I'm excited for what that might mean, is in terms of going back to what you were saying about if you can't see it, you can't be it. I do hope that that's inspiring some players coming through.
For sure.
Yes, definitely. I was wondering if you could each tell me your favourite story you heard when putting the book together. And I am happy to hear any stories that might not have been able to be published. We won't share this recording.
Fiona?
Sure. I had a couple. There was definitely a funny moment when I was speaking with Julie Murray, interviewing her, and you know how you sort of do the while, you know, nodding while people are talking. And there was a moment where she talked about, you know, they were at an airport and about to collect their baggage, and then she said, and that's when the cats fell through the ceiling. And I definitely had a moment where I went, and then I went, wait, what? It was just so unexpected. So there literally were cats that fell through the ceiling while they're in, I think, Moscow at the airport. So there were some random moments like that. But and I probably should have led with the other one, because this is not as it's not as cheery, but Kate Beerworth, or Beersy, as she's referred to, was the physio that basically held the team together for so long with no resources, to the point where she actually, and this happened for years, even while I was working with the team, I saw it firsthand. She would put players up in her house after they'd had knee surgery, like knee reconstruction surgery, and look after them in that, you know, that 24 to 48 hours after going through under, you know, general anesthetic and a major operation, and would really, I mean, she went above and beyond for the team. So that's one of my sort of favorite behind the scenes stories, because what she did for that team when they had no resources and no help, I just, hats off to her. So some stories like that, or perhaps Dialogich, you know, chipping ice off her bike tires because she couldn't even afford a car. But she was so dedicated to her football that she rode a bicycle to training in Canberra winters and was chipping ice off the tires. So they're probably three of the ones that stand out for me.
Love that.
One of my favourites, if I can throw one in, is sorry, Claire, you were going to say something.
No.
Fred Robbins, who he's been nominated as the coach of the decade for the 70s and 80s. He was Jim Selby's assistant coach. He transformed women's football in Queensland under the guidance of Elaine Watson. And he told me that when Elaine recruited him, he was due to he went for an interview for a really prestigious job coaching the Brisbane Strikers team. So this would be in the late 70s, you know, and he was a shoe-in for the job, and he'd been assured that it was his job. And then Elaine had approached him the week before and said, will you come and coach the women's team? And he said, oh, well, look, I've got this job at Azzurri coming up and I'll probably have that. So you never know, if that doesn't come off, you know, maybe I'll think about coaching women's football. But he only said that to Elaine because he was absolute 100% confident that he was going to get the job and he would never have to coach women's football, right? And so sure enough, he's went for the interview. He's then been told he's not getting the job. It's driven home, and on the same day as he's walking in the door, the phone goes, and it's Elaine. I heard you didn't get the job at Azzurri. So that means you're coming to coach the women's football. And he said he was still in such a state of shock at Elaine's machinations that he was just like, yeah, okay then, I guess I am then, you know. And it was just this kind of, she knew more about it than he did before it was happening. She was such a superstar, and she was so on it, you know. And as a result of her foresight, Fred, as I said, he was the first male coach to try and reconcile menstruation cycles so that players' training and injuries and stuff could be taken account of during that process and stuff. So he did a lot for women's football, you know, and it's all because Elaine badgered them into it in the first place. So that's one of my favourites.
Yeah, I love that story. I mean, that's interesting in two parts. One, the kind of serendipity of, and perhaps the male ego of like, I've got this other thing, I'll say yes to keep you happy. And what he, you know, I'm sure that experience and that growth for him, like what his life, how fundamentally his life changed probably because of that. And then it's also interesting. So that's like, what's that period, the 70s and the 80s, and that kind of knowledge of women's bodies and women's health. That seems lost though in a lot of sport, that it's just like too taboo to kind of, or that it's just so male dominated that actually training athletes that are women is so much is missed out. And I think, I don't know if you've got some opinions on that in terms of coaching styles and what we've lacked in terms of actually coaching women as distinct from men.
One of the challenges in football in particular is that for a majority of a young women's football journey, they've had male coaches. And so then when they are afforded the opportunity, a gift of being coached by a woman, they're initially resistant, and there's some research that backs up that resistance, you know. But then after a period of settling in, the reason that for the resistance is because they generally assume that the woman's only going to be there on a temporary basis as the coach, you know, that she'll be replaced by a man at some point. And so there is this kind of, but once that settling in periods occurred, then women are by far and away, by a long margin, much more comfortable with a female coach than they would be with a male coach. You know, but football, as you know, there are loads more players than coaches, so there are always limited opportunities for female coaches to come through, and female coaching licenses are much harder to get than male coaching licenses. So that makes it really hard, I think. I forgot what the point was I was going to say. It's just another example of how difficult it is for women to get into the game and stay in the game after they've finished playing. Yeah,
I think just, and Fiona, you probably have some stuff to say on this, just that coaching women is different to coaching men, and without getting into too much essentialism, because I think there's a whole other talk around how, you know, binary gender stops a lot of people participating, and if we were more relaxed about who could play together, then perhaps sport wouldn't be so elitist. But just on the issue of coaching women in women's bodies, if you've got some things to say about that, Fiona.
Probably just even if going back to from an injury perspective as well. So things like menstruation, not talked about. It was the US women's team sort of looked at it in the 2019 World Cup. So they'd brought that research back to the fore and were really using it to their advantage to help players out and make sure they were well looked after. I know women have a higher incidence of knee injuries. And so we know, it's kind of been dismissed that whether menstruation has something to do with it, but I think can't be ignored that our bodies are not smaller versions of men's bodies. Our hip shape and the way our knees move are different, and all of the research has always been around just, you know, smaller versions of men. So, and also women for a long time really didn't want to acknowledge that we had higher incidences of knee injuries because it's been so hard to even get onto the pitch in the first place. We didn't want another reason to be kicked off it.
Yeah.
Because football's not safe for women, blah 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 blah. We've heard it all before. So there's a lot of things like that are at play that are starting to be researched just on their own. They're starting to look at, okay, well, what do knee injuries look like for women, and what kind of preventative measures do we need to put in place? So it's starting, but it's decades too late, if that makes sense.
It sure is. For those who haven't read the book, can you tell us about the origin and the principle of whooshka, which was my favourite story from the book?
Yeah, that's a really hard one to explain. So Tom Samani, who's probably the longest serving Matildas coach, and he's sort of seen them through 2 stints and was really integral to the growth of women's football at a national team level in Australia. He has a saying where he talks about saying whooshka, and it's a really tricky one to explain, because I did actually get Kate Beerworth, the physio, to try to explain it to me as well, because I've heard it firsthand as well, but saying, how do I define this in the book? And it's basically, he says, he uses it as his explanation of, the pitch isn't great, or we're in some pretty hostile environment where they're in DPR Korea, so you need to kind of help the ball along, help the game along, and go whooshka, then the game's all ours to win. I don't know if that explains it, but it's a really nice kind of saying, and he says it quite a lot.
Yeah, I mean, for me, when I read it, it just seemed to be the thing about women's sport, and in this case, football, that your conditions are always terrible. You don't have a training facility, you don't have the best pitches, you're training at the worst times, you don't have any equipment, you're in all of the stuff about not getting a decent uniform that was made for a women's body, all of that stuff, that this is all of the stuff that women have to deal with. You're not being paid, all of those things before you get to the game. Then you're trying to play the game, and who's got the energy to deal with all of that to then actually compete at a standard? So I just I don't know, it made me laugh, and I think
that's brilliant. You've encapsulated it well. It's brilliant.
I'm presuming that's what I'm imagining the coach is on about with.
I think you got to make it happen yourselves, and maybe momentum will help you then. Like once you're in the flow, then it will happen.
Yeah. And having played soccer a lot, I've definitely been on those pitches where you're traveling along with the ball at your feet, and then you look around and it's in a ditch. So
yep.
Alrighty.
So the bounce is really hard because you're on the hardest pitch that obviously doesn't get watered very much. And
yeah. Well, I mean, pre-drought, I played on some pitches that were pretty wet in Melbourne, so it was more likely in a puddle. Just to change note a little bit, I want to talk about the 2003 Crawford report, which looked into Soccer Australia and primarily the men's game. And you write about it as the authoritative response to increasingly obvious levels of corruption, complacency, and ineptitude by and within Soccer Australia. You state that rather than resolving many of the obvious challenges in the women's game around lack of funding and lack of resources, it kicked the problem down the track. You follow up with a story about the very successful Jano Fernandez, who learnt her trade with Heather Reid, and that's a whole other story that we can talk about too, and is quoted as saying, if you put $1 into the women's football, you get more bang for your buck. So when I was reading that, it seemed to be the parable of the times. Men are allowed to administer at such a low standard, and women's sport make do off the smell of an oily rag, and then that rag is taken from them. So then I was thinking about the utopian place that we're hoping for. Is a world in which there are fully funded and resourced women's leagues going to save us all? Will sport save us in this capacity?
Yes, is the answer to that. Women's sport will save us all. We were at the World Cup final in 2019, and to be in the stadium where 60,000 people chanting equal pay, equal pay, equal pay, which I'm led to believe was started by one of the Australian fans, Sarah Grube, I think, has been credited with starting it. That, like, you felt then that things might change, like there might be something on the horizon, and then since then we've seen big contracts being handed to players like Sam Kerr and Caitlin Ford all heading over to the UK, and then even the UK teams pulling in the likes of Alex Morgan to Spurs and stuff like that. So there's definitely kind of echoes of the machinations of the men's game at the elite level, bleeding into the operations of the women's game at the elite level. So there are elements there where that visibility of the game is going to help, and I think that more and more the Taylor Harris photograph stuff last year, and there is a visibility around women's sport that's the more you see it, the more people want to watch it. The more normalised watching women playing sport is becoming for people, and that, like you said, both you said before we started talking, it's a much better sport to watch as well. So I think that sport can save us all. It's so much more inclusive. Women's sport in particular is less about money. It's less about cynicism. We get the best of everything in it, and so yes, I think it can save us.
It definitely feels to me like 2019 in particular, it felt like we'd kind of wedged a foot in the door and we were not prepared to step back. For me, I think social media, and this has been a decade of social media getting to this point. It's not, it hasn't sort of happened in the last year or two, but it's the Fox Sports who used to control the narrative and all of the footage are now just one platform, and they're no longer controlling the narrative. So it feels like women have actually finally got a chance to tell their own stories, and there is now starting to be a bit of a critical mass that your Fox Sports or your other major media outlets or platforms are starting to try to catch up, or they're not in control of it anymore. I think that said, there's so much more work to do, and there's no chance of resting on our laurels. And in some ways I think, oh gosh, why is it still so hard to get even the most basic things for women? So obviously, like this W League season, the broadcast has not been great, and I've often thought this would just be absolutely unacceptable for men's sport. Yet for women's sport, they would have put a skeleton team on. It would have not been their highest priority, all that kind of stuff. So I guess that's a really long way of saying it has the potential to save us all. And I think 2023 should really kick us into the next stratosphere, but the foundations need to be laid and it needs to be really shored up. I think we know, for example, say with 1999 was an absolute breakout World Cup in the US. 2003 it went to China, but then because of SARS it moved back to the US at short notice. And without that sustained development and investment and taking women's football seriously, that momentum can really dissipate really quickly. So I think going into 2023, it has the potential to be absolutely massive and to really kick us into the next stratosphere. But we've got to do it right, because it could all go away very quickly.
It is pretty infuriating that the likes of Foxtel can get $40 million from the government, strip $80 million from the ABC, and we see such shoddy one camera bird's eye view of the pitch. Then we get interrupted with the tech people behind. Like, yes, it is COVID, but nobody wants to watch the guy for 10 seconds during the middle of a game during your W League season. It is really infuriating. I think I guess there's other models as well, like looking at the WNBA this year. For a $20 US subscription, you could get access to all of their games. They run it through their own platform. It's really amazing. Obviously, the impact of the WNBA team and the political kind of advocacy they did in America, ended up affecting the US election results.
Absolutely.
If you empower women and you give them the resources, then we see all of these benefits. I guess I'd like to kind of hear your thoughts for how we will kind of see the 2023 World Cup in Australia play out, given that we're living in a COVID reality. What looked very shiny in 2019 looks like there's going to be a lot of obstacles getting players and teams from other countries in here, let alone it being a celebration for fans and for the hosting cities and towns. What are your thoughts about 2023?
Yeah, I don't envy the organisers having to come up with all the contingencies for it. I feel for them. It must be really, they must be racking their brains right now.
I think we'll all be vaccinated and we'll be fine and everything will be normal.
Oh, I love your enthusiasm. Case closed.
Like,
All right.
okay, honestly, honestly.
I'll see you at the games.
Yeah, absolutely, Claire. Absolutely. Let's not worry about it until then.
No,
Okay.
but even beyond that, I mean, we know, I think the international or the broadcast will be crucial, and the media coverage will be crucial. So we know for 2019, more than 1 billion people tuned in to watch the final. And that's before we even kick it up to 32 teams. That was only with 24 teams. So there's going to be even more people watching it. I think it's going to be crucial to get that broadcast coverage right, both domestically and internationally.
And you think that the current W League might be the time that you would work on some of those things to lay their framework to get the talent in, to skill people up?
Yeah,
but
absolutely. That said, though, 2019 they had all female commentary teams, which was really exciting. Like Optus got on board with that, so I'm looking forward to seeing more of that. But yeah, like the opportunities are there, and I just would really like to see them do it really well, because I know, so for 2019 there were some really fantastic things, but even at the games, and it was a small thing, but it ended up being quite a big thing, is they had mostly male kind of security guards who would give you the pat down as you went through the gates, and then they only had a couple of female ones, but the problem is that the largest proportion of the audience was female, and the male security guards wouldn't pat down. Like, they obviously had been told they were not allowed to. And even when I walked up and said, I really don't care, I just want to go in and go to the toilet, get a drink before the game starts, not in that order, get a drink, they wouldn't pat you down. And so these poor female security guards were just like working double time trying to pat everyone down. And so it's small things like that, but I really hope that we get that right for 2023.
We need some redesign in stadiums too, so there are not an equal number of men and women's toilets, like that. Like it's clearly an issue, where people are missing the game and having to get there much earlier and all that, just so they can use the toilet without having to stand in a queue for an hour and a half. It's ridiculous. So
that said, there were some fantastic toilet queues conversations with like random fans. We're all in it together, and you met lots of random other Aussies, and people who were doing year gap years and tacking on the Women's World Cup while they were there, and that kind of stuff. So.
But I mean, that is the thing, right? That these really basic things that organisers can't get right or think of just shows the lack of women and non-binary people being in positions of power they're just, the lived experience is so different. So there's no one organising a 50, 60,000 per person event and not thinking we're going to need toilets. Like,
what's going on?
So, I mean, that can be the frustrating thing about being a fan of, and even just with I know it's COVID related in terms of they couldn't easily put things out, but with tickets going on sale for the AFLW, just no information about it, no maps, kinds of things that are just really basic, no-brainer stuff, and they can't get right. And it's just like that. I mean, that to me is the low-hanging fruit that we should be doing. Let alone how do we get people like Sam Kerr performing at their best in front of us in 2023.
And there's a brilliant initiative in with Adelaide United, where they're having a game on March 21st that's free for everybody to go, and they're trying to drum up interest and get as many people there. It's a technique that worked really successfully in Europe to draw people to games, large numbers of people to games, to generate interest and for people to see the quality of the product. And so we should probably mention that there are some brilliant initiatives going on prior to the World Cup, as well as the stuff that's missing, that's obvious, that's missing, conspicuous by its absence, But there are people working hard to make sure stuff is happening as well.
And there's definitely some women, fantastic women like Jane Fernandez, who are overseeing this. So we've got the right, you've got your Sarah Walshes in there. So we've who former player and now really phenomenal and experienced administrator. So I have full faith in the team that's actually going to be delivering this, that they're going to do a really fantastic job.
I have no doubt in that team. One, how do I get on it? And two, may the men get out of their way is probably the best we can hope for them. I do have one just final question. Will Michelle Heyman equal or better Sam Kerr's goal scoring record today, or will we have to wait a little longer? Is today the day?
Oh, I hope so. I hope so. She's playing with such confidence at the moment.
Yeah.
She's really found the joy. When she left, she was, struggling with her mental health. She didn't feel like there was a future in football, and I'm stoked to see her so back and so comfortable and happy. And that's when she scores the most and the best goals. So potentially today's the day.
Yeah.
I don't want to say that in case we jinxed her.
No.
That's
too late.
You've already said that the whole World Cup is going off without a hitch because we're immune to COVID. So
it's going to be fine.
I think we're not going to put the Moz on the shelf. Oh dear. Actually, there is another thing that I read in The Guardian recently. I can't remember which player it was, from her teammate in Canberra United, talking about being able to play freely and to be backed and to be supported, to be herself, and how important that is. And that's a whole other hour talk that we probably don't have time for, but through my own personal experience playing sport, what that means to go, the difference between playing in a club where you're welcome and at a club where you're told to adjust, or that part of you is not welcome. So it is great to see Michelle out there flying. And if we wrap up, maybe now we can all go and watch that game. I'd just like to say thanks, Fiona and Lee. I loved reading your book, and I've loved talking to you today. And I hope that next year we'll be at Lake Tyers together talking about our plans for World Cup 2023.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thanks so much, Claire. It's been so much fun talking to you.